Hello and welcome to the Diaspora Gothic channel. Today I wanted to touch on something that is a hot topic right now on YouTube and in the overall discourse as well. That being the purported decline or downturn of hip hop as a genre or perhaps even as an art form. This discourse is really interesting to me as someone that used to cover music and particularly local hip hop in Boston when I lived there. And while I'm really enjoying the discourse, I do feel like there is an angle that is a little bit missing in the scope of these discussions. That angle being the role that gentrification plays in affecting local music scenes overall. That is to say that when local music scenes suffer, it has a broader effect on music as a whole, and that also pertains to hip hop and its growth and trajectory over the past maybe 10-15 years. To be clear, I worked as a freelance music writer for the better part of the late 2010s into the early 2020s. So my commentary is based on the events that I saw unfold during that time and into the present day. I would describe myself as a hip hop fan that also takes a critical approach to music writing and music journalism overall. So this kind of story is right up my alley. Before I get started, if you like what you see here and you're new to the channel, please feel free to give me a like and start a discussion with me in the comments below. And of course, hit that subscribe button. So the main thing I want to talk about is how gentrification plays into the decline of local music scenes and the interplay that that has with the music industry overall. I would say that as a young millennial, I've seen the music industry and sphere of what it is to listen to music and be a part of local music communities really shift dramatically over the course of the past 15 into 20 years. I vividly remember when artists were able to launch their careers off of MySpace or otherwise have their music circulated in the blogosphere and find their fan base that way. And from the 2010s into the 2020s, I was a fixture in the local music scenes of different places that I lived throughout that time, those being Boston, New Orleans, and now New York City, where I live now. One commonality of all of those places, Boston, New Orleans, and New York City, are that they've all faced their fair share of gentrification and coping with the cost of living crisis. So while that was all going on, I was part of these local music scenes and I had a front row seat to what was happening in terms of the changes that were going on in the scene itself. By being a part of these scenes, I was able to establish my career as a freelance writer covering arts and culture and specifically local music. Now, I do try to keep up with mainstream music and artists that are already signed to labels, but I do have a special love of supporting independent artists and artists in local music scenes all the same. So in terms of my timeline, I spent pretty much all of the 2010s in Boston into the year 2020. Then I lived in New Orleans from 2021 to 2023 and have lived in New York City ever since. But I grew up in northern New Jersey, about 10 miles to the west of Manhattan, so I've always been coming into the city and keeping my finger on the pulse of what's been going on here as well. So, for example, even though I wasn't in New Jersey in most of the 2010s, I was still cheering on the scene from the sidelines. I was very heartened when Fetty Wap came out in around 2013, 2014, and it's been marvelous to watch the rise of 070 Shake and their crew coming out of North Jersey in the time since then. Now, in Boston, where I started my career, there was a pretty big independent music scene up until around the pandemonium of 2020, and this scene also had a pretty big hip-hop contingent with a lot of what I'll describe as alternative hip hop, but I think that even is a little bit of a misnomer. Even that moniker, I think, obscures the very diligent work ethic that a lot of the artists in the Boston scene had, whether they were from Boston originally, which most of them were, or whether they were transplants that were establishing themselves in Boston. Now, New Orleans has its own really unique and dynamic scene when it comes to hip hop, specifically with the whole bounce music scene, which I think is really, really cool and I'm a big fan of. And there's a conversation to be had here about how, even though New Orleans' scene is well respected in the hip hop community, I don't think that there is a lot of industry buy-in to the local artists there, but we'll get there. So in thinking about the music scenes of New Orleans and Boston and New York City, these cities are all in the midst of what we know to be a cost of living crisis. All of these cities are facing their own forms of rising rents and gentrification. Specifically with Boston, I saw how the scene was really reaching a peak in the late 2010s, and then the pandemonium of 2020 really wrought havoc on the scene because it dried up all of the opportunities for musicians. In each of these cities, there is an area that is emblematic of this sort of gentrification, whether it be Allston in Boston, the 7th Ward in New Orleans, or Bed-Stuy in New York City. So in my view, what has happened is that as the local music scenes have all shrunk, the hip-hop scenes associated with each place have also been affected. One aspect of this is the quality of the local scenes itself and whether or not they are hostile to their hip hop market. So yes, when it comes to Boston, for example, there was a force in which gentrification caused some venues to close, whether that's due to rising rents from the landlord onto the club proprietor, or also the price of the liquor license, or other types of costs of running the business. Especially in and around 2020, we saw a lot of well-beloved venues shut down for these reasons. But we also have to contend with the hostility that existed across other venues when it came to hip-hop acts and shows. So around this time, I was going to a lot of music shows, and I was also just in community with a lot of musicians and rappers and getting to know a little bit of what was going on for them behind the scenes. And I remember the frustration that a few rappers had expressed to me when they had reached out to venues to plan shows and were told by the venue that that venue does not book hip-hop shows. Which, obviously, when you're told that, you probably are asking why. And while a straight answer was never given, we can assume or imagine what was going on in the venue owners' minds. And then you also had the issue of established venues not booking local musicians to serve as openers for touring acts. And there's also a bigger overarching issue, which is the pay-to-play mentality that a lot of venues have when booking shows of any genre. That is, they expect the artist to pay upfront for the so-called privilege of performing at that venue. So while hip-hop was especially sidelined during this time in Boston, I do feel like these issues have affected all types of music performers. And then of course, when we arrive at the pandemonium of 2020, we have a lot of working artists no longer able to gig and make their living. From my anecdotal knowledge of artists that were really present in the Boston hip-hop scene up until 2020, a lot of them have unfortunately left or been displaced because of the rising rents and other reasons. This is even before we get to the question of industry buy-in to these local scenes and whether or not these artists that are up and coming have access to the larger industry. Whether that means record labels, PR professionals, or anybody else that can elevate an artist's career. Another creator here on YouTube, reedmysole, did a really good take on this called Capitalism is Dying, Not Hip Hop, which I'll link in the description. With that in mind, let's talk about the industry perspective for a second. At the same time that local scenes are facing these challenges, industry attention is shifting away from local scenes and more primarily to social media. I think it's fair to say now from an A&R perspective that no one really needs to go to a local show to scout an artist when platforms like TikTok exist. The old scenario of being scouted at a talent show or open mic or just singing to oneself at a gas station no longer really is possible. This has caused an ongoing frustration for independent artists that they now have to beef up their social media presence at the expense of actually honing their craft. One really interesting case study of this phenomenon is the rapper Doechii. Doechii, as we know, is extremely talented, and her career has been on an upward bent ever since she kind of broke through in 2020 into 2021. And she broke through because of her talent, yes, but also because of platforms like TikTok. That is to say, we don't really associate her as being part of the scenes of either Florida, where she is from, New York City, where she lived at one point, or Los Angeles, where she lives now. I would say Doechii's success is a little bit of an emblem for how the music industry operates now. Now, there's another conversation here about how Doechii is taken seriously as a rapper and not pigeonholed like most other women rappers, but that's a conversation for another video. When it comes to local scenes, there is an element of how grassroots is it really? In addition to balancing how grassroots the scene is to whether or not the scene can be an elevator to the industry. Looking at New York, for example, New York's hip-hop scene is absolutely not grassroots at all. I think the general sentiment here is that you really have to build a buzz around yourself before you can even really do anything related to your music. It's almost as if you have to wake up one morning already on The Breakfast Club. I would say it's increasingly harder and harder to be known from building your name around the local scene. Now, one important disclaimer here is that all of the cities of Boston, New Orleans, and New York City are kind of outside of the epicenters of hip-hop now. Those epicenters being places like Atlanta, Houston, and Memphis. So there is an argument to be made that the simple loci of where hip-hop artists are able to cross over has just shifted geographically over the years. But that's also underpinned by a conversation about the consumer side of local music scenes, which is that people don't really support their local hip-hop artists. In general, people tend to support artists that have already popped off. This is true across genres, but I think it applies especially to hip-hop. Not only does hip-hop stardom usually require a certain level of image, but it's really hard to get people to pay attention to you unless that image is already cultivated. And it also may be hard to stand out if your music does not completely align with the scene of the city that you're in. For example, I think it'd be really hard to have a career as a conscious, more boom bap type of rapper if you're in the New York City drill scene or the New Orleans bounce scene. One other element of this conversation that I feel like has not been given its due weight is the presence of queer and trans artists in hip hop in the past 15 years, especially considering how scenes like Boston's hip hop scene is really known for its strength and quantity of queer and trans artists. In 2020, I had the privilege of publishing an article with Bandcamp about how women and non-binary identified rappers own the scene in Boston. In the time around 2019 into 2020, this was just an indisputable fact. I don't know what it is about Boston as a city or as a social climate, but in general, the women and non-binary people that were in rap music just made better music. At that time in Boston, people were not really checking for more macho male aesthetics or patriarchal approaches to lyricism. Now, I haven't lived there in a couple years, so I don't know exactly if the scene has kept this character, but it also calls into question whether or not the contributions of queer and trans rappers can be taken seriously and weighted appropriately. And this is not even to mention other scenes across the United States, such as maybe the Twin Cities or Portland, which do just have an alternative bent to the artists that they support. But this is something we have to consider in the scope of the conversation about the alleged death of hip hop. There is a sort of feedback loop at play here. In this feedback loop, you have the nightlife ecosystem kind of foreclosing on the available venues that the scene can participate in. The scene shrinks as a result. The community kind of falls away from supporting the scene that once existed. The artists of that scene scatter away or otherwise stop performing, and the scene continues to shrink. So essentially all forms of music, and especially independent music, are suffering because of this, and hip hop is just a microcosm of that overall struggle. With the erosion of local scenes, I wouldn't say that hip hop as an art form is completely dying, but perhaps the archetype of the hometown hero is what's becoming more scarce. In New York City, this is definitely the case. The Bed-Stuy of right now is unrecognizable to the historical Bed-Stuy that produced Biggie Smalls and other influential hip hop artists. And as gentrification continues to push people, and especially people of color, out to the margins, you'll see this happening more and more. I think of someone like Lil Tecca as an example. Lil Tecca is associated with the New York City scene, but he is one of many people in the fabric of New York City who have been pushed out to the city's farther reaches. And in fact, he launched his career from Nassau County on Long Island. So as this continues to happen, don't be surprised if the next hip-hop generation comes out of places like Far Rockaway. That is simply where the culture is being pushed. But at the same time, I would also argue that the local music scene of gentrified Brooklyn is also struggling. Whether it is the pay-to-play mentality of venues or the overall lack of money circulating in the creative economy, all music scenes are feeling the pressure. So my personal feelings when it comes to hip hop or any other genre is that the forces of gentrification and the cost of living crisis are affecting the scenes no matter what or where they are. And I think that's somewhat by design. The industry is broke right now. Not only that, but they realize that there is less money to go around everywhere. From their perspective, they would prefer it if you spent what money you have on artists already in the industry than supporting your local scenes. In a way, they'd actually prefer you to be rather alienated from the amazing rapper, singer, or instrumentalist at your local neighborhood open mic. And I use that word alienation quite intentionally, almost in a Marxist way, because it applies. In the framework of alienation, the industry has already captured all of the potential artistic power of the scene, therefore rendering the scene obsolete. So in this light, a lot of what I said has been retroactively explained. It's here that I wish that I had an actionable list of things to do about this situation, but I really don't. Everywhere, we're seeing the notion of a living wage for musicians being called into question. Whether in the scope of hip-hop or other genres, it's becoming increasingly difficult or near impossible for an artist to make any sort of living wage from touring, sales, streaming, or anything else. From what I've seen, a lot of indie artists are turning to Europe as a place to tour rather than the US, even if they're based in the US. Europe is more densely populated, therefore you can do more dates with less travel. But even with that advantage, many of these artists still go on these tours and barely break even at the end. At a base level, I would love to see more people support their local scenes and go to shows and support artists in their area. And at the same time, until the cost of living crisis eases up, there's not going to be a lot of money circulating in that creative economy anywhere. In hip-hop's case, it remains to be seen how the situation really resolves itself. But we shouldn't be afraid to call it what it is. Even though hip-hop holds up exceptionalism as part of its core narrative, we shouldn't be afraid to say that the art form is being adversely affected by the surrounding ecosystem. What I do want to say is that I would like to see people invest more in their local hip-hop scenes and their up-and-coming artists, even if their music is kinda crunchy and their lyricism is not completely developed yet. If we're going to speculate about hip hop as an art form, but we're not present in these local scenes at the genesis of what's actually being created, then what are we doing? To me, I think that if you only follow hip hop by established artists and you're not a part of your local scene, then you're not an expert. You're a consumer. And that's okay, but let's call it what it is. Then again, I can't name a single Moneybagg Yo song off the top of my head, so what do I know? Alright folks, that's the video. Thanks again for making it this far. As always, I would love to know what you think in the comments, and also let me know what's going on in your local hip hop scene. What emerging artists in your scene should we know about? Let me know that in the comments as well. This is Hassan with the Diaspora Gothic channel. Thanks for watching.